Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Program Officer for Education, Leadership, and Engagement here at Community Progress. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I encourage you to share your name, organization, and where you're signing in from in the chat. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we're joined by Alan Malik, Senior Fellow at the Center for Community Progress, Michael Braverman, former Commissioner of Housing and Community Development for the City of Baltimore, and Danielle Lewinsky, Chief Program Officer at the Center for Community Progress. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box below. We will share slides and a video recording of today's webinar in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at events@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Alan.
Thank you, and good afternoon. First, I'm going to try to share my screen to bring up the PowerPoint. And, oops. Share. Doink.
I'll say hello to everyone.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Today, we're going to be talking about challenges and opportunities in changing urban housing markets. And that's a somewhat long-winded title for something that I think is really important, which is the way housing markets in cities have been shifting really since the pandemic, in effect, for the last roughly 6 years at this point, and what the implications of these changes are for people who are working in urban areas, working with vacant properties, working with housing rehab, trying to revitalize neighborhoods. And so what we're going to talk about today is two things. First, we're going to talk about what is going on using Baltimore as our case study and why it's going on, why it's happening there. And secondly, we're then going to try to derive lessons from that experience, which can be useful for people working in other cities, towns, villages, neighborhoods, wherever, because I think there are a lot of important changes going on, and they have some very significant lessons for how we do our work. And one thing is we're really interested in getting a sense of whether what we see going on in Baltimore is actually happening in other cities and towns around the country. So as you listen to the presentation, please enter what thoughts you might have or observations you might have about what's going on in your community that parallels or that doesn't parallel what Michael and I are going to be talking about is going on in Baltimore. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael to start us off.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. Privileged to be in this crowd. I saw so many people from all over the country who are working in this arena, and it's great to be part of this crew. One of the things we wanted to talk about is what's happening in Baltimore, and as Alan said, what we can learn from it. But what's happening in Baltimore is that the number of vacant buildings are going down, and they're not just going down a little, they're going down a lot, and they're going down steadily, and they have been for the past 5 or 6 years. And so one of the things Alan and I were scratching our heads about is, kind of what's happening. And yes, there are some theories that maybe they're not really going down, that maybe the city isn't counting them right, but I think all of the data taken together suggests that in fact they are coming down. And one of the important things to look at in terms of rationale is the upper quartile prices. This has upper quartile in the darker blue and upper decile in the lighter blue. But the upper quartile prices is where we assumed the rehab vacant houses would end up in the upper quartile. And
Michael,
yes.
Can I interrupt very quickly? For those who may not be savvy about the terminology, that refers to the prices of the top quarter of all of the sales in a given location.
Thank you. And Alan, jump in anytime. I look forward to the additions. So we're looking at upper quartile, and we see that they steadily rise. And as their rise, those rising prices also reflect rising demand. So we have what's essentially happening is prices are rising above replacement cost, and we have demand and comps at those price points, and we are seeing people moving into the city and buying houses in our neighborhoods that for many, many years we struggled to attract the middle class residents to. And we're very fortunate to have neighborhoods now that are seeing some, incredible rehabilitations and incredible price points of people choosing Baltimore again. So it's been a very long time since we've seen that happen. But once prices get above replacement costs, and this slide is not really to get lost in the sort of details of what replacement cost exactly is, and it's going to rise as housing prices, the shells go up in price. But the important point is that it's rising above replacement cost for 1,200 square foot row house, using that as a typical Baltimore house as an example. And when that effective demand for our inventory occurs, the inventory gets absorbed, and we are seeing this effective demand lower the number of both new vacants that are coming in and existing vacants that are on the market. And to be clear, like most everywhere, this differs by neighborhood and even within neighborhoods. But generally, what we're seeing is a demand at price points above replacement cost. So, if we go to the next slide, Alan, we say this is largely a private market phenomenon that we're seeing here in Baltimore. And we're seeing demand not just in places that we've seen before. Vacant buildings have been going down here precipitously since about 2020. But in some neighborhoods, like this one, the markets were seeing effective demand at price points above replacement cost even before that. But here in 2024, this house sold for 470,000. This vacant house sold for 470,000. It's largely a private market phenomenon, so their pro formas look a little bit different than some of our community partners, and that's only natural. But the quality here is really what's attracting our buyers right now. So it's the product that we're seeing that's on the market right now that's you are unable to get anywhere else in the metro area at these price points. And so this is really an example of what we're seeing and what's driving demand. And then so we have demand, we have inventory. Where's the capital for all this coming from? And we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay. But before we talk about that, let me switch gears and saying, who is the demand? What is the demand? Now, the first thing to understand is that most of these houses that are being rehabbed, and again, I'd like to stress what Michael said, these houses are being rehabbed by private developers, mostly small scale operators, not the big national companies, local small scale developers with private money. They are not a product of any form of public subsidy. So the first thing is realistically, these are primarily being developed as rental housing, which means they're developed either by an owner to hold on to it and rent it out, or are sold by the developer to an investor to hold and rent out. But what's interesting is there's a significant difference between neighborhoods in that respect. So, for example, in the middle neighborhoods, which are neighborhoods typically that were struggling before and having trouble getting reuse of their vacants, but nonetheless had a pretty decent fabric and were still intact as neighborhoods, there's a much higher share of home buyers than when these houses are being rehabbed in more distressed neighborhoods. And Now, clearly, one of the issues, and we'll get to this, is how to increase the home buyer share in these houses. But what's interesting, when we looked at buyers, we found a very interesting thing. Is first, over the last 5 years, the number of Black buyers, and for those of you who are not familiar with Baltimore, Baltimore is a majority Black city. The number of Black buyers has risen much faster than the number of white buyers. Secondly, the in the middle neighborhoods, there's been a significant increase in white buyers, but an even greater increase in Black buyers, while in the struggling neighborhoods, there's been a huge increase in Black buyers. The other thing that's really interesting is that of the buyers, the Black buyers, you might say the typical Black buyer is a single woman, some cases with children, some cases without, with a steady job, earning probably between 75,000 and 150,000, who is basically priced out of the kind of high quality move-in houses that developers are now developing in Baltimore. So there's some very distinct markets here that are not necessarily the traditional market for home buying in the city. These are a lot of people who might have gone to the suburbs 10 years ago, but are now being priced out of the suburbs and are in the process of stabilizing a lot of urban neighborhoods. So back to the financing, Michael.
Thanks, Alan. So we have this resurgent demand that we've highlighted, and who is financing it? Where's the liquidity coming from to move so many properties in such a short time? And what this slide shows is the from uh, from the grace of a private company known as forcasa.com, which you can look up. This is a private aggregator of data, um, gave us a snapshot of the data in which we were able to cull out what Baltimore was invested in Baltimore City over the past 6 years. And that's $5.6 billion of private lending have, and again, it's where I'm going to speak for a minute about what that means. That's out of the norm because this industry, the part that we'll talk about that's new, just is a brand new phenomenon countrywide. And so Baltimore's slice of that largely $75 billion national industry was 5.6 billion. The little map on the left shows you where that money was invested, and it is largely in what we in Baltimore refer to as the black butterfly in the city, seeing a phenomenal amount of investment. And in the middle neighborhoods, the larger shares creating home ownership opportunities. What's important to note is that funding for rehabs, it was often from private lenders in cities all over the country. It's where you can access capital without the time frame and the sort of proctological exam that you would get through banks if they are even lending. So private lenders, it's not uncommon. What changed, though, is that there, private lenders would most often be looking at home ownership opportunities, so the takeout would be the mortgage. So again, what's really important, comps are rising as well as prices. Um, but this new product called a DSCR loan hit the market around 2019, and that's debt service coverage ratio. But the simple fact is that you could borrow with private lending to do your acquisition and rehab, and then you could take out the money with a 30-year mortgage in a also a private loan, and that loan would be aggregated and securitized on Wall Street. And a new product is out there called non-qualified mortgage-backed securities. So that whole new Wall Street phenomenon is pumping a lot of money into places like Baltimore, and that is meeting a demand that has been latent for a long time because we have seen markets in Baltimore where prices were selling, houses were selling above replacement cost, vacants were absorbed, but it is spread much further, and prices have gone higher and absorbed so much more of the market. And a lot of that's due to the capital that's available. Rents have gone up. In a minute ago, I talked about the takeout for rental. Because rents have also gone up, the numbers work, but the comps are coming from the home ownership sales. So if the numbers work now in Baltimore, the capital's there for home ownership and rental. Now, obviously, if there's a tree through the roof, the private sector is generally, not going to be looking to capitalize that, but they're agnostic about whether it's a vacant house or an unimproved property. So what we're seeing is since unimproved properties are a lot easier to get title to, the majority of these investments are improving existing unimproved homes, and half the number of buildings are becoming vacant. And the ones that aren't caught up in this market, Alan and I will talk about in a minute.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Now, just to summarize before we go into the next section, what we're seeing in Baltimore is prices are rising above replacement cost. Developers are rehabbing houses in significant numbers. Home buyers, as well as renters, are showing up, willing and able to buy houses at those prices. And financing structures are available to enable developers to do all of that. So this is a significant departure from what conditions were like 10 years ago. So what does this mean for the work we're all doing? How should all of this affect our policies, our practices? How do they affect local governments, NBOs, land banks? And especially, how do they affect the use of our public resources? So this is what we're going to talk about in part two, and we're going to offer 9 very specific suggestions to consider for how you should think about possibly changing public policies if this is something that's going on in your community as well. So first, Michael.
Thanks, Alan. This is the most basic point, and I'm sure it is not new to anyone who is listening today. But to design interventions, you really need to turn the lights on in terms of what the parcel level data that you have access to is can inform you about, right? Where are the vacants? Where are the blocks where they're being renovated? Where are the blocks where they're not? Who are legacy homeowners? Where are they? Where are the vacant lots? Who owns what? What recently sold? What's under permit? All this stuff is critical to understand the landscape so you can make an informed strategic decision. It's very, very basic, but in many places, that kind of data is still a work in progress. And it's really, really hard to make a strategic intervention without sort of the spatial representation of that kind of data. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is 2 examples, one from a private vendor called Ptolemy, and their product's called Building Blocks that assembles and displays much of the data that we just discussed. And the others, what some cities do is develop and build their own model, which Baltimore did, and that's called CodeMap. That's the one on the bottom, and that's built and maintained by Baltimore. And I just want to give you a little taste of what, some of the things you might do with data like this. And I wanted to start by giving a shout out first to Mike Goldie, who some of you may know, but an old colleague of mine who actually did the overlay that's on top of CodeMap here and all the data manipulations that it took to really understand or get a working understanding of what's happening in Baltimore. And also, I wanted to thank Bob Pippick at Healthy Neighborhoods, who supported this research all through the trouble it took to sort of sort through this. But if you look at that overlay, what we've done, and this is an example of anything that could be done when you have the data to work with and the curiosity. There's a blue square like on data parcels. You could might be able to see that, but that's where either a vacant was rehabbed, a non-vacant building was improved and sold, or anywhere any of that 5.6 billion landed over the past 5, 6 years. So in other words, it's either a rehab or an investment. And if you look at that little green triangle, that's telling you every vacant building that has not either sold or been permitted in the past few years. In other words, it's simply not showing a pulse. Um, Now, it turns out there are 750 blocks in Baltimore with only one vacant building, and that theoretically should have been rehabilitated in this market. So, we'll look more closely at those two different types of market resistant vacants in a moment. But the key takeaway is that you need it's important to have the ability to see spatially, and it's critical to understanding your market and making informed decisions about intervening.
Great. Great. Now, number two, don't duplicate what the private market
Hey,
can do better.
Alan.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So sorry. Did you want to run the poll that we had discussed, or do you want to wait until later?
Why don't we wait until we finish the presentation and start the Q&A?
Sounds great.
Great. Okay. Don't This is so fundamental, and yet it is consistently ignored by local governments and nonprofits. If you and particularly because many of them don't know what the private market is doing. So the key point is, if a private developer can rehabilitate a house without public money, don't put public money into rehabilitating that house. Public funds are scarce. Identify where the private market is working and then figure out how to complement developer activities, not compete with them. And again, this is so basic and so critical and so often ignored. And just by way of making what might sound like a snarky comment, public funds should not be used to prop up nonprofits for the sake of propping up nonprofits and giving them work to do if that work can be done without public funds. Number three, as we talked about, in a lot of neighborhoods, more of the houses that are being rehabbed by the private market are being rehabbed for rental rather than for home ownership. And clearly, there's some very significant benefits to having a critical mass of homeowners in a neighborhood. And from a policy standpoint, you don't want to see that number eroded, even as houses are rehabilitated. So, one of the things to do is actually work with the developers, find out how their financial models are operating that make them go towards rental rather than home ownership, and try to figure out how you, as a public agency or a nonprofit, can intervene in the process to shift the balance, to incentivize them basically to put the houses that they're rehabbing up for sale to home buyers rather than to investors or maintained as rentals. So this is something that requires actually working closely with the developers who are building rehabilitating the housing units and figuring out what the incentive is to basically shift their business model. And it could be quite a small amount of money plugged into the system that would shift their model and get you more home ownership in the neighborhood. Third, and this is critical, I mean, we're talking about environments in which prices are rising and where there is certainly a potential risk to the affordability of the existing stock to the people who are living in that neighborhood at present. So at the same time as you're seeing a neighborhood change with higher prices and home buyers moving in and all that, which is a very positive thing, which you basically want to see happen in your city, you also need to focus on maintaining affordability. And here, I'd like to make first a really important point. If you're going to have a strategy to maintain affordability in a neighborhood, it has to be quantified and measured. If you just adopt some kind of a general policy of we want to prevent gentrification or we want to preserve affordability or so forth, without quantifying it, how many units, at what price points or rent levels and so forth, if you don't quantify, you won't have an effective strategy. Once you quantify, then you look at the neighborhood, look at your options, and see what they are. You may want to build new high-tech or other housing in the neighborhood. You certainly, in most cases, will want to preserve and make sure that existing high-tech or other projects don't go to market when the use restrictions expire. You may want to look at certain existing units in the neighborhood that are what are called sometimes NOAA or naturally occurring affordable housing and try to see how those can perhaps be preserved on a long-term basis. Or you may want to work with the developers who are rehabbing the housing to offer financial incentives for them to sell them at a lower price or to rent them at a lower price and make them part of the affordable housing pool. So either way, you create the goal is to create a neighborhood in which people are not being displaced and in which a certain stock of affordable housing exists, even as neighborhood prices otherwise are going up. And another thing that's particularly important is as neighborhoods change and new people move into a neighborhood, there's often conflict over priorities, over how properties are used or what people do and so forth between newcomers and older residents. And it's really important in terms of maintaining a stable and healthy neighborhood to ensure that people communicate with each other, that there is a means for those issues and conflicts to be resolved. Then finally, the process that's going on involves individual housing units, which means it's fragile. If you had a major recession or a major change in the economy tomorrow, all of this growth in private rehab, house prices, and so forth could disappear because if the neighborhood as a larger entity, it does not change at the same time. So it's very important to provide public resources to strengthen the fabric of the neighborhood beyond the individual housing units. This can include things like parks and open spaces, shade trees, streetscape improvement. It can also include improving schools and community facilities, recreation centers, and so forth, and upgrading and the commercial corridors in these neighborhoods, which are often, even when you have some strong revival of housing, in many cases, you need to have a separate effort to jumpstart the revival of the commercial corridor. So these are some basic thoughts about how to use public resources to complement the private investment and leverage the private investment to create stronger neighborhoods for everyone. But there's more. Michael?
Thanks, Alan. I just wanted to jump in and compliment just a couple of things. One is that because the markets vary across the city and even within a neighborhood, and there aren't necessarily the same drivers at the same level everywhere. Certainly, we still need CDCs in some locations, not in others. And in other locations, it's not that we don't need CDCs. It's just that there's so much work you identified for community to engage in that, but it may not in some places be development. And I have heard in talking with community leaders here areas of the city where when the CDC gets some inventory, and they know they're private developers in their area. They're asked, if you could we'll just take the property and deliver a homeownership product with no subsidy. And I think that's what you were leaning towards when you mentioned we shouldn't prop the CDC up only to do the rehab.
Yeah.
But we need tremendous need for our community-based organizations across the city, different maybe in different markets.
Yeah, there's a lot. There are important roles for CDCs and community-based organizations in stabilizing neighborhoods. Those roles do not necessarily involve building or rehabilitating housing.
Well, let me jump in and say, so this is an interesting point here about thinking ahead to the most challenging neighborhoods. A lot of us, have been weaned on, built from strength and from learning from some of the efforts that have been made in the past that fell short for one reason or another. And but what we're seeing in Baltimore, if we could just sort of divide it into two categories, just for the purpose of this discussion, it's obviously more varied than that. But if we were just to say divide it into two categories, we might say one is a set of blocks where the market will renovate without subsidy, and another is a set of blocks that require either some subsidy or a much larger public sector intervention, right? And that's on top of everything Alan talked about earlier about affordability. So markets change, and we've waited a really long time for this one. But if it continues on the present course, um, we are going to be knocking on the door of some of the more distressed areas of the city where those vacants are concentrating, that are not in transition in one way or another. And so the need for long-term planning, for large-scale planning and investment, is now because some areas may need new types of housing stock. Of course, not everybody wants a rehab row house, new street grids, but that's going to require sort of site assembly. That's a 3 to 5 year minimum enterprise. And so we need to engage in support our communities in their plans for major revitalization, which is capital heavy and isn't going to come from the private sector, so that we are ready 3 to 5 years from now. So that's one type of concentration of vacants in the category of requiring really some vision and some investment. On the other side, there's another, Alan, if we go to the next slide, um, there are a lot of vacants that are in markets that we talked about a little earlier. We saw the picture of this house a little earlier, but on the same block is a house that has been unresponsive to the market for all these years. And you see a picture of it, it's easy. If developer got a hold of it, it would be rehabbed. There are 750 blocks in the city with just one house on it, no, that one vacant on it, and that vacant um, would be absorbed into a market where the comps are there and the demand is there. So that's a strategic use of the data, but also a type of vacant. The other type of vacant that isn't moving forward in this market, again, it's more diverse than two categories. We're going to put it into two categories for purposes of discussion. Broadway East is a good neighborhood in Baltimore to discuss. 42% of all those vacants in the city that are not recently sold or under permit, um, or scheduled for city owns them or our housing authority, et cetera. Those that are strictly unimpacted by the market at this present time, 42% are all in 10 neighborhoods. And they are the darkest brown on the map. And on the east side, which is on your right side, is the Broadway East neighborhood, which is there, and its cursor. And in that particular neighborhood, um, we have on the west side of the neighborhood a growing market. And if you see this vacant here, this is on 1800 block East Lafayette. It is on the same block, and it is the only vacant on this block, next to this house that rehabbed and sold for 270. Again, this is a different row house than the 470 sale out in the Liberty Heights corridor, but you can see it's beautifully done. Same as the house out in Liberty Heights corridor. It is the product that is attracting the buyer. But that vacant should move by the same token, on the eastern side of the neighborhood, some much larger scale renovations are going to be required. And this is a good neighborhood where it displays both. So, we will need the larger abandonment and collection of vacant lots and vacant buildings is so concentrated that and the community has vision here, but we need to support it and we need to bring it into our planning department. But we're going to need some site assembly and some big picture visioning. And what Alan and I are suggesting is now's the time to consider that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to assemble the tools that you need as a public agency to get control of these properties, which is not always easy. Now, I'm going to address two remaining issues because one of the things, when you look at a problem block in a city or a town, it's not just the vacants. There are two other issues that it's critically important to address in order to make sure that you're building stable, healthy neighborhoods. The first one is problem occupied rental properties. The property may be occupied, but it's in terrible shape and it has a negative impact on the block or the neighborhood. Part of this is a matter of using effective proactive code enforcement to tackle problem landlords because simply waiting till complaints happen does not solve anything. Secondly, is to provide support for landlords who basically are not evil people, but either don't know what they're doing or are undercapitalized and have financial difficulty. It is not easy to make a buck as a landlord in a neighborhood where your tenantry are people of very low income. So, and then finally, in some cases, try to develop the tools, whether receivership or other tools, to force the transfer of property from clearly demonstrated irresponsible landlords to people who will maintain the properties properly. But this is a major issue in every city, and it's not going to go away by itself. The
Alan,
second, yeah,
I just jump in
sure.
and compliment that sometimes the beauty of a receivership case is that you're going to clean title and transfer a clean title. So it's not necessarily, always a bad landlord per se, but there are situations where the abandonment has created an almost impossible title to transfer. And the beauty of this process is in many, many cases, we can convey clean title and that puts it back in the stream of commerce. And that's
Yeah,
mostly on the two cases where they're very concentrated, that's likely not a receivership result, but in those single vacants on a block, easily receivership can resolve those.
yeah, yeah. The second issue is, which you also see typically on the same blocks, is homeowners, and they are most likely to be both lower income and older people, are having difficulty maintaining their houses and are living in potentially unhealthy and unsafe conditions. And here, the, the goal is twofold. The first is to help people fix up their houses so that they can live in healthy conditions and age in place, as well as help stabilize the neighborhood. And the second, because this is something that happens in neighborhoods where prices are going up, is these same homeowners are often victimized by pitches from wholesalers or speculators or so forth to sell them their houses at prices that, from the homeowner's standpoint, look like a good price, but from where the market actually is a terrible price. And again, this requires intervention and involvement to make sure that people don't see their equity stripped from them by wholesalers and speculators. Along with that is to ensure that homeowners have clear title and can convey clear title to other people so that, again, they get the greatest possible benefit themselves and their heirs from whatever appreciation is taking place in the neighborhood. But above all, to provide the funds and the resources to enable elderly and low-income homeowners to live in safe and healthy conditions. So those are the 9 points that we have. And as we go to the Q&A, we're going to have a very short poll, which we would urge you to fill out and complete and continue to put information about your community in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're now open to Q&A. Danielle?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Michael. So a lot of questions. I'm going to try and consolidate and get to as many as possible. Michael, starting first with you and going back a little bit to the data side of things, as you were looking at the sales prices versus the replacement costs.
Mhm.
The question is basically, how has the rapidly increasing cost of construction really impacted that equation or that phenomenon or that analysis? Like how has that factored into how you're looking at Baltimore, but how should communities factor that in as they're trying to analyze their own places?
Well, one of the easiest ways to do that is, again, the pro formas vary depending on who's doing the development. The private sector folks working without any kind of public funds at all, um, generally, and we're talking about folks that put out a really good product. Um, Generally their replacement cost numbers are going to be a lot lower, right? So there's that built-in variation. But reaching out to the private sector in your community, I've always said that, we all have to row in the same direction. And the private sector, in terms of the small rehabbers, usually provide more capital to this enterprise than all of the public money that goes into subsidizing rehab. So we all need to work together and row together to get the outcomes that we want. They also provide more of the lending capital than we're going to see. So meeting with those in your neighborhood and getting a sense of what those pro forma numbers are. Yes, prices are going, the cost of construction goes up, but so is prices. And so we have and again, there are some markets where years ago when it was a little cheaper, and I only mean like 4 years ago, you could, get a product on the market for 180, and it's not going to have all the bells and whistles of some of the houses that we saw, but it's going to get a homeowner, into a house that has, entirely new systems, including air conditioning. By the way, it's a big deal in Baltimore, and a lot of our older houses don't have it. And so when they're capitalized, they do. But that's a little harder to achieve now. But at that sweet spot in the market, it's still happening.
Mhm. Thank you, Michael. Alan, over to you. So community development corporations, but also, government will frequently build programs around existing needs. But certainly, as we saw as the case in Baltimore, markets can change much faster than institutions, than existing programs. So how do you suggest that whether it's a CDC or a government balance between trying to design their response around here's what's happening right now versus here's what we think is going to happen within the next couple of years?
Okay. One of the things somebody once said, prediction is really difficult, especially when it's about the future. And that's true. The best thing, though, is to really build links between public and private sector people and really talk to each other, because sometimes, you're right, the private sector moves a lot faster than the public sector. And the only way the public sector can keep up with it is by having really good lines of communication with private sector developers. Interestingly, in my experience, and I think Michael's as well, a lot of private developers are very willing to sit down. They're proud of what they're doing. They like to talk about what they're doing. They like to talk about what they see going on in the neighborhoods. So it's not like you're pulling teeth to get this information. And then the other part of it is people should the public sector shouldn't just be trying to elicit information from the private developer world. They should be asking, how can we make your job easier? How can we facilitate? And also, how can we get you to do more sales to home buyers or this or that, the other thing, or work with us on affordable housing goals and so forth. But that I think is the critical element, is to just make essentially make them partners in the whole neighborhood revitalization process.
Thanks, Alan. Michael, over to you again. So, in the chat, there was a decent amount of conversation or mention of investor activity. Particularly, this question is more about the role of investors in single-family housing. And the question essentially is, while in the presentation you all talked about the need to craft interventions around ownership. So you need to know who's owning properties and how ownership is shifting. Michael, do you feel that a place's strategy should shift if it is an investor that is owning that rental property versus a small mom and pop landlord? And then, if so, what sort of information should a community be looking at to be able to delineate between the two types of owners?
I think it's hard to like place a label on, the as investor bad. It's really like, what are we seeing on the street? What are our eyes and ears and our community leaders telling us about how that property is managed? And that tells us whether you're local or you're not, or you're out of state. All we care about is you properly manage your property, right? So a couple issues, short answers, which is one, as Alan mentioned, we want to figure out how to leverage as much home ownership as we can out of this market, because what community leaders often want, yes, they want to preserve affordability and the cultural heritage of the community, but they also want to see their housing values go up, and they want to see more homeowners choose their neighborhood. And so if private developers are building that and creating home ownership and bringing in the type of neighbor that they want, then, everything's going swimmingly. If we are seeing like low end investment, which I think is what the question's getting at, that's a little bit different than what we're seeing right now, because we're seeing properties recapitalized. And the more money you put into your rental, the more you care about maintaining it and who's tenanting it, as a general rule. Alan's done a lot of work on buying houses and renting them until you just throw them away. When you recapitalize the house, you are not intending to throw it away. So you really have to pay some attention to who you are renting to. And so I think, that's the fundamental issue. Who is now running that inventory, or even who's the managing agents? There are some management agents that you look at, they do a really bad job, irrespective of who owns it. And some of our code enforcement activity should identify and focus on them, because some of your out of town investors fall into that trap. They buy the house for some amount of money, and after it's been rehabbed and it has a tenant and it's supposed to make them rich, over time. But in fact, if it's poorly managed, it's going to do the opposite. And it's not impossible to identify those management companies that have a whole bunch of investor owners above them.
Mhm.
I want to add something. I don't know. Is that
Alan, anything to that is helpful. Yeah, the focus on management, it is possible to figure out who your managers are. I would suspect this is where communication with the community really matters a lot, so that you can get that on the ground knowledge of where there might be problems, in addition to other tools like rental licensing, registration processes.
I'm
Alan,
just looking
anything
at
to,
your,
oh,
I'm
go
just
ahead.
looking at your violation notices. They
Mhm,
roll up, disproportionately to a couple of management agents. That's a good place to mine.
mhm, mhm. Alan, on neighborhood change, question for you about schools. So, when you're looking at neighborhood change generally, sort of how does school quality factor in? In other words, in what you've seen, does the market always follow the schools, or can the schools follow the market? And then the second sort of part of that is, are there things places should be doing to try and strengthen school quality in order to help bolster a market?
Well, the answer is either can happen. I mean, schools can follow a market or vice versa. And one thing is I would suspect that most of the home buyers in Baltimore and other similar cities do not have kids at all. And now, however, some of them may eventually plan to. So building up better schools may not actually be what gets the market started, but it may be a critical step to maintaining a stable, healthy neighborhood, because you don't want people to buy a house and then the moment they got a little more money, get the hell out of the community. You're trying to build a stable environment. You're trying to build a place where if people do decide to have kids, they're more likely to stay than not because it's a good environment in which to raise their kids. So the schools can go either way, but in the long term, they become a really important part of the picture. Another thing that's just relevant is that in some respects, good schools are a proxy for property values. So in terms of wanting, looking for appreciation, people are going to gravitate to neighborhoods with good schools rather than not.
Danielle, could I just say like one thing, a point is that these great questions point out how much we don't know, right? Like we're shining a spotlight on a phenomenon that's relatively new, but there's a lot to study about it and a lot more to learn about it. In particular, we can know very little about right now who these buyers and renters are, the sort of qualitative data, the sort of focus group activity that we might need to really understand who it is and why they're choosing us. And I think one of the things Alan's leading to is because if you're making $100,000 household income or 75 to 150, this is the place in this region where you are going to get the best product.
Yeah. And one thing is, this is a market that is looking for move-in houses. This isn't what you think of as those young people who buy essentially a livable shell and then spend the next 5 years living in a construction site while they rehab it bit by bit. This is a market that's looking for a house they can move into. And that's, I think, a really critical distinction.
Mhm. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions here. And Michael, I'll throw this to you about your experience, I would say in Baltimore, but also your knowledge of programs from other places, specifically for supporting low-income individuals, be those low-income older adults or not older adults, looking for specific program examples of how those individuals can be best supported. So, are there specifically tax abatement programs for low income or low income elderly individuals? Or aside from tax abatement, what are other specific examples of programs to try and support these residents?
So let me interpret that as like for our legacy homeowners who are receiving a tax bill, how do we ensure that they can stay where they are and get the benefit of a rising market and have the house next to them no longer vacant. Maybe the tree growing out of the house next door no longer there. Maybe in a row house world, like they're not having water penetration in their exposed not wall that was between them and the vacant with no roof. How do we get them to enjoy the benefit, help them enjoy the benefit of what we're seeing? And the short answer would be yes, Maryland. State and this, we do have programs that one limit your tax increases as assessments go up, maximize what could be filtered titrated in the raises over many years. But second, have an absolute circuit breaker. If you cannot afford your taxes, and prove that, then you don't have to pay them. But that's a lot of paperwork and lawyering. And the supports, I've always wondered if sufficient supports for those people are here to fill out that annual form. I think you practically need to be, a lawyer for 10 years before you can get through some of those forms. So they need help. They also need help, from the programs that the city has to help legacy homeowners, because now would be the time to sort of weatherize so your winter costs aren't as high, and to improve your ability to age in place with the kinds of things that seniors need. And for that, those are all sort of investments. And so we need to invest in our legacy homeowners and we need to help them. But a lot of those programs are there. They just, I think, need some navigation aid. So we're talking about some of the great roles for community-based organizations, helping matriculate our new residents, helping keep our old residents, thinking about affordability and retail opportunities. There's a lot to do, even if it wasn't, let me rehab houses.
Mhm. Thank you for that, Michael. I know we're coming short on time, so I'll try to maybe wrap in one other question. Alan, I'll get you the first crack at it. We had a number of questions that came in that were around how you preserve affordability, but also get to that sweet spot of enabling a mixed income neighborhood. So that's both for existing residents, Michael, as you were just saying, to benefit from the wealth creation that happens when markets change, but also making sure a diverse type of incomes can continue to find homes in a community. So, Alan, the question is really about, can you speak to specific, whether that's policy interventions or programs that communities should be looking at, not just to preserve, existing LIHTC, for example, but to get to that panacea of diverse incomes within a community.
Okay, and it goes back to one of the things we talked about. You cannot do that unless you have a quantified, measurable strategy for targets, because otherwise you're just flailing around. What if you're a local official and you're concerned about this, or a local official working with a CDC, hopefully with this concern, you really have to look at what's happening in the neighborhood. Who is the population? What populations, in terms of incomes and so forth, do you need to retain in order to have that mixed income neighborhood that is your goal? And remember, a lot of the neighborhoods we're looking at are not overpopulated. In many cases, we're talking about, by virtue of restoring vacant properties, adding population rather than replacing population. So there's some wriggle room there. And then developing a strategy to preserve affordability around very specific targets for the numbers and the income ranges of what you're aiming at. And that's the point where you then have to start looking at what are the strategy options. And here, again, as I said before, and this is really important, work with those developers. You might, let's say a developers are rehabbing 100 houses in this neighborhood, and your strategy calls for maybe 30 or 40 of them really ought to be affordable housing as distinct from housing on the market. Work with those developers to find out how you can incentivize them to provide those units as affordable housing. At the same time, preserve the LIHTC projects, perhaps do new projects, identify older rental units, for example, that are potentially available, and try to preserve them as affordable housing through various means and programs. So the point is you can't simply just say, we want to preserve affordability. You need a strategy. It's got to have lots of elements to it. The private developers have to be part of it. And then, and only then, I believe, you can actually have a realistic shot of achieving that goal.
Thank you guys so much. Sorry, my computer is freaking out. Thank you guys for this wonderful webinar. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Danielle. We dropped a link to a short survey in the chat. If you could please fill it out, to just share some about your experience today, that really helps us to improve webinars going forward. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about the Reclaiming Vacant Properties conference happening in Pittsburgh this September. There'll be a lot more conversations like this there, along with a ton of other things about the field generally. Danielle, did you have anything you wanted to add about RPP? Awesome.
Register.
Yeah, early bird closes July 17th. It's your best chance to get the best prices before they go up. I hope everybody has a good afternoon.